Hi, welcome today to Pacific Oaks Lunch and Learn. Today we have a distinguished presenter, Dr. Jamille Harrell-Sims. Dr. Jamille Harrell-Sims is an adjunct instructor at Pacific Oaks College in the School of Cultural and Family Psychology and in the School of Education's Bachelor's and Master's programs in early childhood education with a specialization in trauma studies. Dr. Harrell-Sims received her doctorate in human services with a specialization in family studies and intervention strategies from Walden University, where her dissertation, Parental Knowledge of Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking Among African American Parents, opened the conversation on culture, ethnicity, and sexual exploitation. She received her master's degree in communication studies, intercultural option, and her bachelor's in speech communication from California State University, Los Angeles. In 2010, through the American Institute for Resource and Human Development, Dr. Harrell-Sims was granted a distinguished Fulbright Fellowship to Tanzania, East Africa. As a retired probation officer with over 16 years of experience in law enforcement and an instructor for the University of California Davis Center for Family-Focused Practice, Dr. Harrell-Sims trains probation departments and group homes in California statewide on domestic minor sex trafficking, as she's a subject matter expert. She aided her community as a school probation officer in Adelanto for 7 years, the longest tenure for a school probation officer in San Bernardino County. Her community programs and influence kept many at-risk youth from the school to prison pipeline. She has 10 years experience as a family law paralegal, specializing in family mediation and child custody cases. She has worked extensively with marginalized families and created programs for communities with historically disadvantaged children. Dr. Harrell-Sims served as the Chief Operating Officer of the American Institute for Resource and Human Development. She is a member of the Golden Key International Honor Society, National Organization for Human Services, Association of Black Sociologists, and is a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Dr. Harrell-Sims has received numerous awards and commendations for her work with at-risk adolescents and their communities, as well as serving as the chairperson for the Adelanto School Attendance and Review Board for 7 years. Dr. Harrell-Sims has written several programs targeting at-risk youth and families living in the margins. She is a published author of 2 books and has written several published articles for the American News and has developed programs for children victimized by sex trafficking and their families. She has lectured at numerous venues regarding the seriousness of child sexual abuse and sex trafficking and is a strong advocate of unique educational modalities for youth and increasing higher education for children of color. Today, we welcome Dr. Harrell-Sims, and we look forward to her webinar today.
Hello, and welcome to Pacific Oaks College. We're going to have a great discussion today. Well, actually, it's a lecture, but I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to be down to earth with you. I'm also the CEO of Kagler Interventions Incorporated, and we deal with marginalized families and support communities. So I want to welcome you, and I'm going to ask you to have an open mind. You may not be comfortable with what you're going to hear today, and I am absolutely fine with that. We have to have a discussion about race and ethnicity, especially at this time in our country when there's so much pain and suffering and anger. So I'm going to ask you to take a deep look into yourself today as we discuss racial and ethnic trauma. Okay, so again, racial and ethnic trauma. If you go on the internet, if you go on any type of social media, that's all you're seeing now. You're seeing people posting things with anger, with fear, and we need to deal with that. So that's what we're talking about today. So, to give you a quick overview, We're going to discuss the true nature of race. Most Americans don't even understand what racism is. So we're going to define racism. We're going to talk about the socio-historic effects of systematic oppression, generational trauma, and we're going to discuss some issues facing certain ethnic groups. I won't be able to go through all of the ethnic groups. We only have 45 minutes, so it's a lot of information for me to give you within the 45 minutes while you have your lunch. And we're going to discuss the psychological effects behind institutional racism. And probably the most uncomfortable part is exploring and confronting your own biases. And lastly, we will discuss strategies for unification and understanding, because we need to come up with solutions instead of being part of the problem. So first, some strategies for unification and understanding is we have to have some mandatory multicultural history classes in K through 12. What has happened in our country is that we have learned a Eurocentric lens all through our primary years. And what that does, it excludes other groups and what they've accomplished and what they brought to the table. So we need to, all K through 12 districts need to have that as part of their history class, not Black History Month, not Latino History Month. We need to have that included in American history all year round. We need to have intercultural communication. We need to learn how to talk to each other. I teach communication studies, and you'd be surprised at how students will not, it's very difficult for them to engage with others that don't look like them. They believe what they see about others through the media instead of having that conversation. We're going to have to talk about race, class, and gender. I just did that last night. And gender is, now we understand that gender is fluid. We have to talk about these social constructs. We need to turn off that TV. It's a television. KRS-One, a great rapper, says it's a television because it tells lies to your vision. So we need to turn it off. We're so stuck on social media that we think everything, we don't realize that this is negativity going into your brain, and so it's really perpetuating our negative thoughts about others. And we need to have equity and equality in education and resources. Equity and equality are two totally different things. They really are, and we're going to discuss that. And we need intercultural think tanks. We need to come together and discuss how are we going to come together. We need to understand, the trauma and the experiences of others. We need coalitions to work on the strategies for inclusiveness. Lastly, cultural competency trainings. Now, I've been to a couple of cultural competency trainings. I do conduct those. But in the past, I've been to these trainings, and they were very one-sided and based on a book. So the person teaching you and their credibility has a lot to do with how you receive that information. So what is race? Well, I'm starting with Johann Blumenbach, but really I have to start with Carl Linnaeus, because Linnaeus was the first scientist to say publicly in his thoughts of the time in the early 1700s that race dictates your intelligence. And so what he said was that if it wasn't, if you weren't from the so-called white race, then you were less attractive. He said that Asians were docile. I mean, certain things that he said that were incorrect, but during that time, they accepted that as being scientific and being true. So this created this nonsense of the system of white supremacy. But then Johann Blumenbach came through and he said, wait a minute, that's not exactly true. We had these racial classes. We had Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid. Those were the three basic racial classes. But then we turned into 5 racial classes. And Christoph Meiners, who turned around and said, well, no, that's not true. The Caucasian race or white race is the one that is superior. They have everything that is needed to be an outstanding citizen, and they have the intelligence. So you have to understand where all this came from. But the bottom line is this. You know, race is a social construct. It really is. It doesn't exist. Because if you look at the animal kingdom, you can make a tabby cat with a Siamese cat. You can make a pit bull with a Labrador retriever. It's still a dog. The cat is still a cat. Us as human beings, you know, we don't have to stay within our phenotype. There's one race, it's the human race. And yes, there are differences, but our differences are our strengths. So most people don't understand the difference between race and ethnicity. I've had people say, well, I'm half German and half Irish. You can't be half German and half Irish because they're not races. These are ethnicities. You know, if we sit back and think about how all this was packaged for us to believe that we're so different and we have these different races, all that is false. This is why we have to change the narrative. We have to change how we teach. Race is one race, the human race. We're different ethnicities. We have different cultures and languages and customs. And yes, we look different. And yes, you can have a person from one ethnicity mate with someone else, and the children have this exotic look, but they're still human beings. And that's something that we have to understand. So I find most people don't really know what racism is. I've asked the question in some of my classes, what is racism? And most students say racism is when you don't like a group of people, or you don't want that group of people to have anything. Well, kind of, sort of. But let me explain to you that racism requires power and privilege. So I've seen arguments where this group can't be racist, or that's racist, or this racist, and we take that word and we just throw it around and use it to fit whatever we want it to fit. But it requires power and privilege. So people who are marginalized are not able to be racist because they don't have those two components. Now, if we're in China, and let's say some of us, okay, I'm African American. If I go to China, I will experience racism because they have the power and privilege in that country. But if I go to East Africa, where I've been, I found that the issue of power and privilege, it switched. Because even though I was in East Africa, and even though I am of African descent, being American put me on a pedestal. So within that country, I actually had power. They looked at me as having power. Racism is a systemic issue. And that means that it's not just a single thing that we deal with. It's in the system. The United States basically has a long history of racism. It's in the system. It's in the educational system. It's in the workforce. It's in healthcare. It's everywhere that we look. In order to get rid of it, we have to change the system. It's also a worldwide institution. It's not just the United States. And we tend to think, oh, this country's so racist and it's going backwards. Well, there are other countries going through the same thing. It is a worldwide institution. There are countries that have had wars behind racism or ethnic cleansing, as you will. And it's fueled by very narrow ideologies and narrow systems. So people who perpetuate racism are not able to be open-minded and think outside the box. And this just continues it. You have to understand what you believe about race has been fed to you through the systems that you grew up with, through culture, through ideology, and through media. Now, let's talk about these systems for a minute. The educational system. We all know about Brown versus the Board of Education. But has anything really changed? Because we still have racism in our educational system. Our SAT and ACT exams are biased. It is true that African American students do better on the ACT than the SAT. It's a matter of language. Each group has their own language. It may be English, but it's their own language. Our educational system does not it does not have equity and equality. There is no open-mindedness when it comes to other groups. We do have teachers who have low expectations of children of color and LGBTQ children. We do have teachers who they're afraid of the children. They don't know how to communicate. So their answer to it is to send the child to the office. Suspensions. We have the school to prison pipeline. We have a huge number of children of color in special ed that aren't there because of academics. They're there because of behavior, but no one, as a school PO, I was able to go to the homes and see, why is this child falling asleep in class? Because the child is living in a house with 5, 6 people, and it's a one-bedroom apartment, and the child's sleeping on a mattress on the floor. So we have to look at those things. Our financial system. Let's talk about loans. Let's talk about what just happened a few years ago when we had the banking crisis, where the housing prices skyrocketed and they were handing out these subprime loans to people, and people lost their homes. Let's talk about the inequity in wages, where you can have two different people who have the same skill sets and the same educational background. And we can talk about women who still don't make the same as men, and we can talk about men and women of color who have the same background but are still getting lower pay. And there is research that states that if someone did a research that stated that if you send a resume with an ethnic sounding name, you may not get picked, but if you send a resume and your name is Jennifer or Rebecca, you get a call back. So these are things that we have to deal with and we have to talk about. Access to resources. Everyone knows where the higher tax base is, that's where the money goes. That's where there's better schools and programs and Whole Foods and all these different stores and access to things. And generally, it is the middle class. If you're able to get into the middle class as a person of color, then you can have access to that. But generally, people who are Caucasian have the access, which leads to gentrification, which is a big issue now because people are saying, we want to take over the inner city, we want to build Whole Foods, we want to bring all these wonderful things, Starbucks, and that's great. But here's where the racism comes in, because you know that the people who have lived there for years cannot afford to shop at Whole Foods. They cannot afford a $6, $7 cup of coffee. They can't afford these high rents that once these people buy these properties, and that rent went from $1,000 a month to $2,000 a month overnight, they can't afford it. So now you have people displaced. Now you have a high rate of homelessness. Healthcare. There's a big debate right now going on with the current administration and, the Affordable Care Act. There's different arguments on both sides, and I don't have time to argue for either side right now, but I will say this. Access to health care is very important. People who don't have the means to have better health care suffer. So if you are making 6 figures, you have good health care. But the middle class, working class, they don't have access to that. Why? Well, they have access. They just have to pay for it. But you have to understand how racism is institutionalized to the point where they get the lower tier of health care. Access to food, again. You can have a superior market that doesn't have the greatest food, it's not the top grade. You can have a Stater Brothers, or you can have a Ralph's or Whole Foods that has organic food. Organic food costs so much that people who can't afford that are just eating food that is not of, we know about GMOs, but most of us are eating GMO foods that we can't afford to shop at places like Trader Joe's and Sprouts. Marketing. Let's talk about marketing for a minute. How many of you that live in the suburbs see ads for cigarettes and alcohol and strip clubs? Ads, HIV ads. You don't see that. These ads for harmful things to your body are usually in the inner city. I haven't seen an ad like that where I live. at all. But when I come into Inglewood or on Crenshaw Boulevard, that's all I see. So the marketing, they market to certain groups to make money. And it's harmful, but it's not about health and it's not about well-being. It's about the dollar. Media. I don't even know if I need to even go through the media. The media shows negative images. We have these reality shows where all this negative energy, you may look good on a reality show. It's great to watch because it's entertaining and you're laughing and oh my God, what's going on? But these are negative images that are being fed to children, to families, and these negative media images are so powerful that people that don't normally have any communication with certain groups really believe that that's how they are because that's how they're fed. And housing discrimination is big. It never stopped. I've had people say they have applied for housing in certain areas and get denied. They tell them, oh, it's available, come see it. And as soon as they see this person, all of a sudden it's already been rented. Yes, it's illegal, but it happens. People are still doing this. Redlining. People are being corralled into certain areas because that's the area we plan for you to be in. So as you can see, racism is so deeply embedded in this country, and we're just talking about this country in all aspects, that you can't put a Band-Aid on this. This never went away. It just changed clothes. That's all it's done. So the socio-historical effects of racism. Okay, so we're going to go back 400 years. We're going to go back 400 years, and a lot of people don't know about Bacon's Rebellion, which happened when blacks and whites got together and fought against the government. Yes, they lost, but it was so frightening that during Bacon's Rebellion, they wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. So at that point, they told the white people, well, at least you're not black, and created this divide and conquer strategy, which still works today. So the effects of racism, anger and resentment. Of course, the people who are the subjects of the racism, the ones who are the victims of it, are angry. They have a lot of resentment. And a lot of people say, well, why are you so angry? That happened a long time ago. You know, you don't live there. You can't say that because I'm going to go a little deeper and talk about the effects of social historical trauma. The marginalization and crime due to lack of resources and employment. It's not that a certain group has a tendency for criminality, because all groups have a tendency for criminality. Every group. Asians, Caucasians, African Americans, Latinos, Middle Eastern, whatever your group, human beings have that ability to be criminal. That's sometimes a choice, but it's always a choice. But when you're in an environment where you have very few resources and very few outlets, you'll resort to whatever you have to resort to. And I'm not saying that it's okay to do things that are being done. I'm saying open your mind and understand if you were in a position where you had to commit a crime or that's all you saw you could do, what would you do? There's miseducation, and again, we kind of talked about that. If you're not educated properly, then you have a very skewed sense of society. You think everything's a certain way and everything's okay. See, if the educational system benefits you, then you don't see anything wrong. But if you're attending school and you don't learn about yourself and you don't learn about this other person next to you, but you learn about this one group, well, what does that do for the self-esteem of the children who are of color or marginalized or who are LGBTQ? All you're learning about is this group. You have no connection to it. And right now, what I'm seeing a lot of is unwarranted and or realistic fear. A lot of people are afraid. I'm going to talk about the police for a minute. I'm going to talk about the killings of unarmed black men and brown men, females. I want to talk about that. That's not a thing that's just been happening the last few years. For those of you listening who think that there's just this rise of police killings, these killings have been going on for years, since the slave patrols. So there is a great fear of police by marginalized communities of color. But there's also this other side of the fear, and they call it white guilt. And that fear is, if there is true equity and equality, then we lose our status, or we lose our privileges, or, how will I feel about that? Or there's not enough of us, or we're losing this country. I want to make it very clear, this country belongs to everyone who lives here. It's not any one person's country. That hypervigilance, I have found myself being in certain spaces and just going through the fight or flight mode of waiting for somebody to say something crazy or waiting for something to happen. Right now, the way this country is, everyone's walking around on pins and needles, and we don't trust each other. We don't. And that's another problem. There's two things I want to talk about, and one of them is post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic slave syndrome. Because you don't have to be in a war like Vietnam or or in Afghanistan to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. We're all experiencing that to some degree. In October of last year, when the presidential elections, the results came out, multitudes of young people experienced PTSD. They were afraid. They were crying. Adults were doing the same thing. That great fear created a stress of every day waking up not knowing what's going to happen, what's going to change. We have all these horrible things going on. They are actually terrorist attacks, which does not mean that it comes from a certain group. It's anytime you commit violence, that's terrorism. And so that's affecting all of us. It's affecting us to a great extent. Then we have post-traumatic slave syndrome. Now, post-traumatic slave syndrome was coined by Dr. Joy DeBruy, and basically this is a stress that is generational. It goes all the way back to slavery and it comes forward. It's generational. It's the constant exposure to hatred and racism and marginalization and inequity. It's constant. And you learn to live and navigate in this space. And it takes a toll on your body. It takes a toll on you mentally, and people of color, there's a stigma to getting mental health. And so people are suffering with this. And so when you say get over it, why can't you get over it? You actually can't. You can't get over it because at this point it's in your DNA. We have Stockholm syndrome, and we have violence and hate crimes and drug and alcohol abuse. So generational trauma, in order to survive the trauma, certain behaviors have to be taught. So I have a couple of research articles that I looked at and by different scholars. And what we have to understand about generational trauma, when I have a class, I have them do a genogram where I have them look at what did your parents do? What were they like? What were your grandparents like? What were your great-grandparents like? If you sit there and you make bubbles and get this information and you lay it out where you can see it, what you're going to find is some behaviors that go all the way back as far as you can get to. And those behaviors are behaviors that are learned. They're in you because of the flight or fight. It's a part of your DNA. You don't know why you act like your great-grandmother or why you act like your father who you just met at 30 years old. But that's in you. Mulder, Medina, and Huzink say that unborn children exposed to trauma in the womb exhibit stress issues when they're born. Have you ever heard of the angry baby? The baby's born
cries all the time, or why is the baby always crying? He's colicking. And maybe stressed. That's why it's important when a mother is pregnant to have a peaceful environment, because that environment has a lot to do with how that child takes in nourishment. You know, that child feels what the mother feels. So the issues facing certain ethnic groups, I have to say African Americans and Native Americans have the most trauma. Native Americans, we know the history, we know what happened. You know, the land was taken over, they're forced on reservations, they have lack of resources. People think, oh, they have casinos now, they're doing well. That is not true. That's a very small amount of Native Americans that benefit from that. African Americans consistently dealing with trauma, consistent. Let's talk about Muslims. Since 9/11, all of a sudden, everything is a Muslim's fault. If somebody's Muslim or they look Muslim, people are freaking out. We just had something happen, I believe, in New York yesterday, the terrorist attack. So all this, oh my God, they're Muslim. Oregon has a horrible history of racism. And I have a colleague, I went to grad school up there, that's fighting that, where Muslim women are getting their hijabs taken off. They've been attacked. We've not recently just had 3 people stabbed to death in one of those terrorist attacks, trying to defend 2 Muslim women. And our Hispanic brothers and sisters, I mean, right now it's a hard day for them because they're facing, you know, deportation, the end of DACA. It's a bitter battle. I mean, they had Prop 187 where they wanted to deport a lot of undocumented immigrants, not just Latinos. And I have to make that clear, is that when we think undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants, as they say, for some reason we always think about South America, but we have to understand that we have immigrants from all over the world. So yes, it affects them as well. It affects Asians as well. So it's not just the Hispanics. We have to open our mind and see and understand that. And even though the Asian population really remains relatively silent about things, the model minority stereotype, it really puts a lot of stress on them. I've had Asian students tell me that stereotype forces them to try to be perfect, to try to fit it. And the stress is unbelievable. So it's not that they're not going through anything. They are. They're a culture that more keeps it to themselves until you sit down and have a conversation. So all these stereotypes that we put on people, they affect them. The psychological effects, you know, insomnia, high blood pressure, depression, imposter syndrome is really popular for students who are in college. They just got their doctorate, they just got their master's, but they still feel inadequate. They feel like no matter how hard I try to get to the top, I still feel inadequate. And that's common. There's feelings of hopelessness. And a lot of people are having anxiety disorders because of institutional racism. Just because it does not affect you does not mean that other people are not experiencing it. You can't minimalize what other people are going through just because that's not in your paradigm. Part of that is distrust of the government, educational systems. People are not trusting doctors anymore. They don't trust the criminal justice system. I come from the criminal justice system, and I can honestly tell you there's a lot of inequity and inequality going on there. And so because there's no trust, and sometimes it works, oftentimes it doesn't. And we've seen that in quite a few cases where there should have been a conviction and there wasn't, and cases where there wasn't a conviction and there should have been. So, you know, we have breakdowns of communication, and when you're living in constant defense mode, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for us as a people. So I want to take a little more time on this. And I apologize if I'm going too fast because I have 45 minutes to give you what I can. So I'm not used to talking this fast. I'm used to going really in depth. My training programs are 6 hours or 12 hours. So to do this in 45 minutes is a record for me. But I want to take a little time here because this is the most important part. Are you racist or prejudiced? If you go to the Museum of Tolerance, there are 2 doors. You should go there. One says prejudice, one says unprejudiced. Everyone tries to go through the unprejudiced door, but they can't because it's locked. Because all human beings are prejudiced. All human beings. I'm prejudiced. Everyone listening is prejudiced. But where'd you learn your attitudes towards others? This is where the genogram comes in. Where'd you learn it? Because this is learned. You weren't born prejudiced. You weren't born to hate. You weren't born to minimize. You learned it. Where did you learn that attitude? Did you learn it from your parents? Did you learn it from your homogenous community? Did you learn it from what you saw on television or in the movies? Did you learn it from what you heard in rap music? Where did you learn it? I want you to take a hard look at your family because that's your first environment. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory talks about how the environment shapes the person. So I want you to sit back and I want you to think about things that you've heard from your family members about race, class, and gender. What kind of remarks were made? We all can sit in public and say, oh, this is not good. Oh, this person's this. But you know that when you get in your home or amongst close friends, you say things that in public you would not say. You use terms that are inappropriate. Now I want you to take a good look at your bias. Does it add or subtract from you? Does being prejudiced or racist, does that empower you? Why does that empower you? Does it empower you because it makes you feel like a big person? It makes you feel superior? It makes you feel good? Why do you need to do that? Why do you need to put down others to make yourself feel better? That really is a self-esteem issue. So does it add to you? Or does it subtract? Because I'm willing to bet it subtracts from you. I want you to be honest with yourself. I want you to think about how you view others. I want you to think about every group. I want you to think about how you react when a black male, if you're Caucasian or Asian or Latina, whatever you are, whatever you classify yourself as, when you see a certain person walking towards you, why do you hold on to your purse? You're conditioned to think. There's a movie called Crash. Love the movie. It came out, I think, in 2000, 2002. And it addresses these stereotypes. Where do you get it from? And lastly, why do you feel threatened when the issue of race is brought up? I hear it all the time. Oh, you're race baiting. Let's not talk about race. Or why is it always about race? It is always about race. It is. It's always been about race. It's always been about a social construct in order to empower one group who do not realize that they are puppets for another group that control everything. So why are you threatened? Why do you feel guilty? Why do you not want to talk about it? We're not going to get rid of this until we learn to talk about it. We have to have this conversation. It doesn't matter if you feel uncomfortable. You see, there's a big burden on others, whether they're, sexuality, ethnicity, culture, whatever it is. There's a huge burden that has been unfairly placed on others to make one group feel comfortable. And so they're carrying around this with them, this trauma with them. They can't heal because to want to talk about it in therapy, we say, we have to get to the root of the issue. But they can't get to the root of the issue because as soon as they say how they feel, people want to shut them down and say, don't talk about it. That's not solving anything. So let's look at some of the things that people say. I want to bet someone listening has said this. It's not my experience. Why do I care? Well, why can't they just get over it? It happened so many years ago. I'm tired of hearing about it. Do you suffer from white fragility? Do you have issues with colorism? Because people of color have issues with colorism. Do you expect others to assimilate to your culture? You know, they say we're a melting pot. We're not. We're really a tossed salad. The tomatoes have their beauty. The lettuce has its beauty. The carrots has its beauty. The croutons has its beauty. You put all that together and add some cheese on top, and you get this nice salad dressing called love and understanding, not tolerance, because the etymology of the word tolerance is to tolerate. If we pour some love and understanding on that salad, we've got a great salad. Do you exhibit behaviors that show fear? And is your language acceptable? Because there are things that are said that are really condescending that people don't realize. You think you're saying something nice, but you're not. You have to watch what you say. I was in a bathroom one day and a lady walked up and just touched my hair. I didn't even know the lady. And I looked at her like she was crazy, and she said, "Oh, I just want to know what your hair felt like." Well, I found that offensive, but you felt that you can just walk up to me and touch me. So questions I want you to ask yourself. Do you have low expectations of other groups? Do the stereotypes come to the forefront of your mind when you meet someone? If you're a teacher, do you ignore the child of color in favor of your own group? Or do you have low expectations of that child of color? Do you know the difference between equity and equality? And would you invite someone that's different from you into your home? How do you react around those who are different? Do you feel safe wherever you go, or do you feel unsafe? These are questions I need you to ask yourself. These are very serious questions because the first step in healing is to admit that you have a problem. And at this point, I'll take any questions that you may have.
Okay, I see Penny. Yes, it's Dr. Sims speaking.
Give us just a second and we'll go ahead and get these open for you. Okay, we have one question here. What are the steps we can take to move forward with this knowledge?
Well, the first step that we have to take is taking a good look at ourselves and our family and where we got these attitudes from, admitting that there's a problem. We have to admit that racism and white supremacy exists. We have to admit that it's a part of this country. It's in the fabric of the culture of America. And once we can admit that, then we have to be human enough to sit down and, talk to others who are different from us and understand their experiences. And at that point, maybe there can be some think tanks. Maybe we can, dialogue is first. You can't do anything without dialogue. So to move forward, which is why I spent a little more time on bias, we have to first start with self. And there are lots of books that you can read, articles that you can read. If you are interested in any of these books for your knowledge, I have no problems. If you send me an email, I will send you a list of books to read.
Great. We have another question. Please define white privilege in a way that I, as an African American, can explain to Caucasian coworkers.
White privilege is the privilege of being able to walk into spaces without being questioned, the privilege of being able to have access to resources that others don't, the privilege to be able to take advantage of any educational, financial resources, anything. White privilege is just for the sake of being white. You have some experiences that people of color don't get. For example, being stopped by the police, license and registration, please.
You have the privilege of not having to be afraid for your life when you see the siren go on behind you. You have the privilege of having access to adequate defense if you're being suspected of being a criminal. So explain to them that white privilege is the privilege to have the ideology of what freedom really is, because we don't know what that is. We don't have that experience to be able to be looked at as a human being and non-threatening. That's privilege.
We have another question. That was a lot. Will you be giving future webinars to engage deeper in these topics?
Yes, I will.
We'll be hopefully doing a webinar here at Pacific Oaks.
Yes.
Hopefully monthly. So look for Pacific Oaks Lunch and Learn invite. If you please feel free to forward them to anybody else that you feel would benefit from attending the webinar. It's free to anyone that is in the community. Is there any? That's all of our questions. Does anybody have any additional questions?
Or statements?
There is one. What practices or activities can help a person of color shed internalized oppression? I'm sorry.
Give us a moment.
I'm sorry, apologize. What practices or activities can help a person of color shed internalized oppression and racialized beliefs about other
People
persons of color? Yeah.
Okay. Well, in Southern California, we do have a big issue between Latinos and African Americans. I mean, we can't avoid that. We also have issues between Asians and African Americans, and it's not everyone. It's just you can change systems, you can't change what people believe. But I would say that in order to help shed the internalized oppression, you have to do some soul searching. You have to take care of yourself first, your spirit, that ma'at. You have to get within yourself. See, one of the reasons why we have this issue is because of the educational system not teaching about other people's histories. African Americans, Latinos, we don't know our history. We don't. We've not been exposed to it, and oftentimes we're not exposed to it till we're older. So once you learn your history, who you are, what great accomplishments, all of the accomplishments that were made, it will help you become stronger. And then you'll be able to, you can't love someone else until you learn to love yourself first. And so once we learn about each other, we will understand each other, and then we can bridge and be together. So that's what I would say. Learn about self first, and then hold your hand out to someone else and learn about them.
Wonderful. I think that was our last question.